what can you do when someone who may have narcissistic tendencies is in your life? How can you operate and maneuver around that or with that, I should say?
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one. That's such an important question because so many people, because there's a lot of information out there now on narcissism, are beginning to recognize that maybe my spouse or my parent, somebody close to me in my life has these characteristics, or they just get this feeling, right? Like they don't exist in the relationship. Remember, there's always one person in the room when you're with these individuals because their needs typically take the priority. So inevitably, this is quite challenging.
Join me, Jeremy Swick, on Into the Unknown, a podcast that delves into the personal journeys, stories, and experiences of individuals across diverse professions. As a historian by trade, I firmly believe that our personal histories shape our present and offer valuable insights into our paths ahead. With that being said, let's get into it. On this episode of Into the Unknown, I am joined with a very special guest, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. How are you doing today?
I'm pretty good, thank you.
I really look forward to getting to this conversation. When your name came across the screen and across the email, I was really excited to get to talking.
Yeah, likewise, me too. And thank you so much for having me here today. I'm excited to get into what I think is a pretty complicated concept or topic, right? Narcissism.
It's one of those things where I think at some level everyone faces it, obviously different degrees depending on the person, but I think it's one of those important things to discuss.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So I always like to kick off the show and talk about the importance of networking. How did we get connected?
So I did an interview on Olivia's podcast. We did a deep dive actually. She had a nice example of narcissism in the family, and that sort of led us down the rabbit hole of how do you talk to a family member who's splitting up the family. And she thought that you and I would do really well with this conversation. She said you asked very insightful questions and referred me over to you.
It's great. I love talking to Olivia. It's funny. Next month, she's going to be a two-part guest, and
Oh,
we're going to get into podcasting, but it's just, I love who she brings to the table.
no, awesome.
So I want to know a little bit about you, your origin story, comic book issue number one. Who's Anthony?
Who's Anthony? So the origins. So way back at the beginning of my profession, I worked in a dialysis unit. That's a place where people go when they have kidney failure. So it's a pretty rigorous protocol where they have to go 3 times a week for 3 to 4 hours, to sit on this machine that acts like an artificial kidney. So patients skip their dialysis or they terminate them early, and this is a big problem. So I was thinking about this because the staff would call them non-compliant, and I was imagining that there must be more to this than them just being bad. I'm doing air quotes. So I conducted a study where I just sat down. I had a control group who got usual education, just educating them on what are the consequences of missing your dialysis. And then I gave the experimental group a psychotherapy intervention, which just basically means I spoke to them to try to understand what's going on that you're skipping or shortening your sessions. And what I came to discover is many of them were living in a fantasy, an illusion, we call it, that they were in denial. They really didn't believe that they needed the dialysis. So I would hear stories about how they're off in Atlantic City gambling. And who can blame them, right? Because the alternative was what? Sitting in a dialysis unit getting yelled at by the staff that you're not compliant. So, anyway, as I did more research into this, which I didn't know at the time, but what I realized later is that I was dealing with many patients who have what are called personality disorders, and in particular narcissism, because denial and creating an illusion, an exciting life, where you don't have to deal with vulnerability or painful situations is very typical. So that's what sort of kicked off this whole endeavor into my research, my teaching, my podcast, everything that's focused around personality disorders, but in particular, what we call narcissistic personality disorder.
So what made you want to get into that field to begin with? What started you there?
I mean, in my opinion, these are some of the most complicated cases. These are the patients or the people who go to therapy sometimes for years and years and they don't get better. Or these are the people who have, multiple relationships, multiple affairs, drinking, maybe addictions, and they just can't figure out what's going on. So I guess in a way, this is a quite challenging population to work with. I mean, even most of if you look at social media and you just Google narcissism, a lot of the people out there work with what they call the victims of narcissists. In other words, the people who are with them, but not actually with the people who are struggling with these kind of characteristics. So I think that in part was what was appealing, was really working with a challenging part of the population where there was very little out there in terms of treating them, because people tend to say that they don't change, which isn't actually true, but that's a whole nother story.
So what working with that population? How was that experience? Because I assume it probably wasn't the easiest getting them to either admit, or how did you figure out that they had those kind of tendencies and uh, all of that?
You said something in the question that was really important, and I was just commenting on how society in general is always trying to get them to do something. I mean, your question is spot on, because even if we think about those dialysis patients, the staff were trying to get them to be more compliant, right? To follow the rules. So one thing that I do when I work with these people is I don't try to get them to admit or to do anything. The whole goal of the treatment is to get as close as possible to their own subjective experience. So, like for example, with the dialysis patients that I mentioned, when I said that I wanted to do this study, the medical staff there became very upset with me. They were like, "You're going to talk to the patients about why they don't want to be on dialysis?" Because the whole medical setting wasn't designed in that way. And I said, I want to get as close to their subjective experience. So, yes, I want to hear how they don't want to be here and what they'd rather be doing instead. But the whole point is just to get closer into their world of what we call, this is the main part of narcissism, the grandiose sense of self. I don't know if you've ever been with somebody, or you probably know a little bit about narcissism, but they typically present as very grandiose, omnipotent. They know everything, the center of attention, right? So we want to get closer. That's the whole goal, to what their experience is like in that state of mind and what it's like to give that up, right? Or to live without it. Because the whole other side of that is, believe it or not, these are people who feel very vulnerable and weak or powerless or full of shame. And that's what I started to discover when I got closer to them. Living on a life on dialysis, having kidney failure, all that, as you can imagine, sitting on a machine can leave one feeling very vulnerable. And again, I know I mentioned this earlier, but it's much more pleasant, not adaptive, but more pleasant to live a life imagining like you don't need that, right? So, yes, thank you for that question. The goal is not to get them to do anything, but just to help them understand how this whole system of omnipotence, the grandiosity, is a defensive structure. It's compensatory, it's to overcompensate for something, which are those more vulnerable feelings that they always need to be pushing away, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, and you mentioned a great thing. I think a lot of times it is that shame or guilt or whatever it may be, and I mean, I think I've been fortunate. I think we're on episode 135, give or take, and
Hmm.
there's a wide range of, not obviously just not people I've interviewed, but also people I just know in everyday life, and it's been a gift at this point to really be able to read people pretty quickly, just kind of how they are, and sometimes I think it's those little, as you mentioned, those kind of key grandiose ideas. I'm like, it kind of makes you think a little bit more.
Oh, so you hear it yourself, I would imagine, right? Like you hear, that's one of the definitions too, by the way. There are many different definitions of narcissism, but that's one of them, is when people tend to over exaggerate either their accomplishments as if they achieved a lot more or what they're going to achieve. That's part of the grandiose sense of self. Yeah.
So, on everyone's journey, you make a decision not really knowing the outcome. Can you give me a time where you just went for it?
Huh. So, oh, well, we could think about the podcast, right? For instance, because again, I know I mentioned this earlier, but so much of what's out there is this sort of mentality that the narcissist is, very destructive. They're gaslighting. They're the devil. So this is a very different approach I take on the podcast, and that's risky because it's a more compassionate approach and trying to. It's not to say, you know, that they don't behave in this way. Sometimes they are quite aggressive, because that's one of the ways they can puff up themselves, to feel in control and to feel powerful. So it's not like these symptoms don't exist per se, but they're surface level descriptions of what these people are or who they are. And if you stop there, you'll never begin to see what's going on inside of them. So the whole thrust of the podcast was not to vilify anybody, but it's a more accepting attitude and to understand from a psychoanalytic perspective, because that's what I do by trade. I'm a psychoanalyst who also does psychotherapy. That's just a talk therapy. But to try to understand what goes on inside of them so we don't stop short at just those surface level behaviors. So yeah, so that was a big risk because who knows how that's going to be accepted.
When did you launch your podcast, and what is it called?
It's called the Narcissism Decoder, and I finished 2 seasons. So right now I'm in season 3, and I do actually get some of those messages. Sometimes like on my video channel is like, stop defending them. They're evil. So, but that's what we call splitting, where people see them as either, it's a world of like all good or all bad. And I'm trying to say things are more nuanced than that, that good and bad exist in all of us. And if we could slow down and really appreciate what drives, if it's the aggressive behavior, for instance, then we can have a more complete understanding of who this person is.
Anthony, I think that's a microcosm for the world. I'm a historian by trade, and when I talk to people about history, a lot of times they either romanticize it or vilify it. And I'm like, if we have a couple hours, we would sit down and we could talk, and you learn a lot more of it's being a nuance. It's a gray. This thing has
Yeah,
to happen for this thing to happen. I think sometimes it's easier for our human brain to put things in boxes. So it's either
yeah,
good or bad. It's more like there's a lot more to, I think, the human experience.
yeah. It keeps things simple. It keeps it safe too, believe it or not. And I see, just out of I'm looking at you on the video, obviously, and I see you have a football helmet behind you. But
Yes.
it reminds me, America loves football. We love sports. But like if you go to a football game on a Sunday afternoon, it's easy. It's simple, right? You got the good guys and the bad guys, right? You boo at the bad guys, and you, of course, identify, and everything all good is inside of you, which itself is sort of narcissistic. It's one of the traits that I possess everything good and everything bad is out there. So I appreciate the football helmet in the background. It fits perfectly in with what we're discussing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And well, one of my areas research was kind of looking at back in grad school was kind of the football tribalism, if you will, and
Oh,
how your team is the best team and the other guys are
oh,
terrible. And based on the comics and news strips of the day, it created those larger than life legends, and I think it gave a lot of cities and areas kind of that rallying point to either support or boo, as you
yes,
mentioned.
yeah, yeah. Oh, that's so funny. So again, about this based on your own studies and historically, right? How comforting this is to know that we could keep things simple, and also to know that we possess everything that's good, right?
I couldn't agree more. What can you do when someone who may have narcissistic tendencies is in your life? How can you operate and maneuver around that or with that, I should say?
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one. That's such an important question because so many people, because there's a lot of information out there now on narcissism, are beginning to recognize that maybe my spouse or my parent, somebody close to me in my life has these characteristics, or they just get this feeling, right? Like they don't exist in the relationship. Remember, there's always one person in the room when you're with these individuals because their needs typically take the priority. So inevitably, this is quite challenging. But one thing that's always very helpful is earlier you and I were talking about some of the way the grandiosity presents itself, right? The superiority that someone always has to be in control. But we have to remember, we said that's compensatory, it's defensive, and that there is really a more fragile, vulnerable part of them. And I think initially, at least, this is just step one. keeping that in mind helps cool you down. So when you're in a relationship with somebody like this and you don't have a voice, for instance, or they devalue you, if you're in a mindset and understand where this is coming from, like, hey, maybe they felt vulnerable at that moment, right? Then you can become less reactive and more reflective. And this is no small thing. I know it's hard because, again, if you're being erased, you have a lot of feelings about that. But if you yourself can get into a more reflective state of mind, it allows you then to begin to help them, believe it or not, because you're not attacking them. And this is what I notice all the time. And I see this because I work with couples as well. So these are like high conflict couples. Typically they both, one has a personality disorder, the other one has the characteristics. But once you could slow one of them down enough to become more reflective and ask questions and look through the anger or the dismissing or the devaluing attitude, typically what you see is a more genuine part of themselves begin to emerge. So the short answer is recognizing that, yeah, this person may have these traits, but they're defensive. And that there is I think you mentioned it earlier, and a lot of people say this, somebody more genuine inside. You do see moments of this when they're not defending themselves, when they don't feel threatened. So then the more genuine side comes through when you're not saying, look, I'm just trying to help you. You're acting like a narcissist. And I actually hear that. They say, I'm just trying to be helpful to my husband. And I'll say, well, what did you do? Well, I told him he was just behaving like a narcissist. And I'm like, oh, no, I don't know. Tell me what happened after that, because I can imagine it's going to spiral. And of course it does, because nobody likes to be spoken to in that pejorative way. But if you could slow down and say, listen, I understand you're upset right now, but I wanna better understand what's going on, what just happened. So you slow the whole thing down and you come from a place of like inquisitive curiosity instead of attacking back. I don't know, I said a lot, but does that help get at it a little bit in terms of how to negotiate these relationships?
Anthony, absolutely. I think it's one of those interesting things, and we didn't really get into it. But one of my other backgrounds is education. I was in the education field for a short while, and one of the
Uh,
biggest things was that perspective taking, but also kind of that perspective understanding that there's a wide variety of learners and people, and it's just kind of finding ways to understand. I think is one of the biggest aspects.
understand. Yeah, like just to go back to full circle before I know we probably have to wrap it up, but at the beginning I was talking about the dialysis unit and the research study, and the comparison group got education. And what we discovered, like many other research studies did, is they got worse. In other words, they became more non compliant because you can't educate somebody emotionally. In other words, someone who's already defended and thinks they know everything, which is part of narcissism, trying to educate them is deeply insulting. So what you'll see is usually a boomerang effect. Like, you're going to tell me, well, I'll show you. And that's when they start to withdraw because they feel ashamed or humiliated that you're giving them something that they should know it already. So yeah, so you have to be really careful labeling, educating them, and just trying to take that more inquisitive approach to trying to understand them.
As we mentioned,
Hmm.
some of the early signs and what to do. But what happens when it's already been, I wouldn't say too far gone, but let's say the divorce happens, or the kids no longer talk with the parents, or it becomes that extreme. What is that next step, or how do you see people finding help when that happens?
So let me just make sure I understand it. So if it gets to the extreme, there is a separation. And what's happening now in your scenario? The kids are getting involved somehow? Is that what you're
Oh,
thinking?
sorry. I'm like whether it's a relationship with a spouse, or let's say it's the relationship between child and parent when it's become that full
Uh,
separation.
Yeah, so it depends what you want, right? And actually, this is what Olivia and I were talking about is what do you do with this kind of parental figure? And it all starts with what you want. Do you want to continue to have a relationship with them? Because if you do, and this is what I went over like step by step with Olivia, is how to pull up a chair and the specific words you use. Because I remember she said to me, oh, I did something, or I would just say this. And I was like, oh, be careful. Like specific words are so important And you want to give them the sense. It's almost like working with a child, like when you're an adult and you have a child maybe who's pushing back. You want to give them the feeling that they're in control because that's important to them. So you pull up a chair and you ask them, would you like would you like to work on the relationship? Or you could tell them, I miss you, I still want you in my life. That's if you decide to go this route. But it feels like we have some things we need to talk about. Would you like to talk about them? So it starts with something as being respectful in a sense. Do they want to work on it? And if they're like, yes, of course, now you have something, because you really do have two people who want to work on a relationship and still be together, but they just don't know how. You see, that's what interferes. Inevitably, one says something that insults the other, because with narcissism, they're very, very sensitive. They feel criticized or judged very easily. So that's where the words, the specific words that you use, come in handy. Like, you have to be very careful and approach it like from initially validating, like, I understand that this is what you, or I can understand that you felt this way. But the goal is then to look forward and see how we can repair the relationship, which I won't get into that now because that's a whole nother episode. Okay.
So, title of the podcast, Into the Unknown. Can you tell me what you're working on now?
Right now, the main goal, so my full-time gig is I'm in private practice. I'm in Manhattan. I'm seeing patients all day. So that takes up a lot of my time. A lot of them, again, are with the personality disorders. But in addition to that, the main goal right now is getting out this message, through the podcast, through my video channel, getting at the message that narcissism, yes, it is a very complicated, if we could call it diagnosis, right? Not everybody's diagnosed, but they have these characteristics or traits, but that there's hope, right? That overall, one definition would define it as these are compensatory, they're defensive. And when we begin to lower the defenses and get them more comfortable with a more authentic side of themselves, that's when we can begin to see a healing process take place. So that's been my mission lately, is just trying to get that word out that if you or someone is struggling with these characteristics, that absolutely there is help. As long as you get yourself to someone who's qualified or experienced in this field of working with personality disorders.
Anthony, I appreciate that you mentioned someone who's qualified and experienced, because sometimes I think we talk to ChatGPT or we Google these symptoms and then you're trying to figure it out from there. And
Oh,
of
yeah.
course, that leads to a whole string of issues.
Oh, yeah. It's so funny you mentioned that. I'll just tell you very quickly, anecdotally, a hypothetical patient, right? I use a prototypical patient says to me, well, I was chatting with GBT, like, let's say they just lost a boyfriend or girlfriend, and Chat GBT recommended that you try to get back to another intense relationship. And I was like, no, actually, that's exactly the problem, is the relationships that you form are way too intense. Not using this language, but in the field, in my field, we call it a merged or symbiotic relationship, where you define your sense of self based on how they see you. So when those relationships end, it's very painful. And I much rather help somebody deal with a loss and go through a mourning process than try to replace it with another intense relationship. But unfortunately, in our society, that's again more comfortable. It's like the splitting you and I mentioned earlier. It's much easier to get a replacement than it is to go through a painful process. But after you've been through this a few times, then some people come to recognize this is not working. I'm on my third wife already, and I need to approach this in a different way. And that's typically when they come to me.
I think it's one of those things. I appreciate you mentioning it. I think it's seeing that pattern either in yourself, of course, and others. I think it's easier sometimes, but I think a lot of the work is doing it on yourself and figuring out kind of who you are, and then getting that support. If you need support, as you mentioned, someone who's on their third wife or can't understand why people can't stand being around them, or that they
Yeah.
have those fiery relationships. I think it's
Yep.
one of those things that finding someone who can help support you is important.
Yes. Agreed.
So if people want to learn more about what you do and where you are, where can they find you?
Sure. Everything's on my website. Just to keep it simple, it's drmazella.com. I put a ton of information. The podcast, the videos are there. I usually put out an article once a week. So everything is right there.
Well, I want to say thank you again for taking the time to talk with me. I really did enjoy this conversation.
Of course, and I appreciate you having me. So thank you.
We'll talk soon.
All right. Take care.
That was another fun episode of Into the Unknown. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen. And if it provides you any value or entertainment, I would love if you shared it with others, liked, subscribed, and really just help the podcast grow. Again, tell a friend, tell a foe, just anyone who might enjoy hearing some stories of people's own journeys and what got them to where they are today. Till next time.